Looking at my bookshelf, you could be forgiven for thinking that my answer to what survival book do I think you should buy, the answer would be pretty much anything written by Bear Grylls or has SES written on it. And the truth is that I've never actually purchased a Bear Grylls book, um, although they are quite good. Those are a result of friends and family knowing I'm interested in this kind of subject, and so every single Christmas or birthday, the latest book by one of these TV personalities is an obvious choice of a gift. But I wouldn't put them on my shelf if they weren't actually worth reading or any good. There is a few that I've given away, knowing full well that I'm never likely to get them back again, and I'm not too fussed about that. But there are a couple of books here that I think are worth having and worth reading, especially if you're new to survivalism in any way and you need a direction of thought for what it's all about and what's involved. For me, I've always used books like this as more of a manual as opposed to a sort of something that you just read cover to cover like a novel. I've never really treated the books that I would recommend that way. To me, they're just manuals for very specific skills. Skills that you can't otherwise know without having learned them. You can't really just go out into the woods with no knowledge whatsoever and hope to be able to develop some sort of skills. Now, there's lots of ways you can develop these skills. For Indigenous people or people who live off the land, the skills are taught to them by their parents or relatives or whatever, and you obviously have a whole array of courses and books, and you've got the internet and YouTube and things like that. You're always learning from it. I watch YouTube videos all of the time, and one in every sort of 10 or 15 videos, I see or hear something that I didn't know before. And sometimes I adopt it, and sometimes I don't. Books, I still occasionally flick through a couple of my favourite books, especially for very specific skills. You know, if you want to learn how to do, if you want to learn how to tie a specific knot, you can watch somebody on YouTube do it, but sometimes it's easier, or it is for me anyway, to actually just look at it on a page and then have a piece of rope and go over it a few times. So I'll just pick out what I would say if you didn't have any book whatsoever and you were interested in a book, what you should maybe start off with. I think probably everybody in the bushcraft or survival or prepping community is familiar with this book. The SES Survival book by John Lofty Wiseman. This was the first survival book I ever owned, this actual book. So it's all tattered and all over the place. And I was obsessed by this book when I was a child, like I think probably a lot of people who are interested in this kind of subject are. And it was being given books like this as a child that really honed in exactly what it was I was interested in doing. And an interesting thing about this kind of book and survival books in general is something you come to realise when people buy you books as a gift. A lot of these books are actually just copies of this book, or some sort of slight variation of this book, because it was so comprehensive. It was so good when it was written back in the day that not much in it's actually changed. I've actually got a couple of versions of this book. I was recently at the Bushcraft show, and you know, because the man himself was actually there, I had to, I purchased his latest sort of version of this book, which is exactly the same. It's just very slightly updated and it's in a slightly different format, you know, so I got it signed and stuff. But I would say absolutely, if you're interested in survival as a first book, this book is the one to get, or, you know, a version of this book. Not a lot of people actually realise that he actually did another book, which is about urban survival. Now, it's not quite as interesting, I would say, as the other book, and some of the stuff in it is similar, but from an urban prepper type point of view. This was really my introduction to sort of urban survival, or prepping if you like, and my philosophy being that survivalism isn't really about surviving in the woods per se, it's about survival in the world generally. And you spend most of your time in the world in an urban environment, and it's a very dangerous place, an urban environment. So this book is highly recommended. Next book is Survival Handbook in association with the Royal Marines Commandos. I was gifted this book and didn't really think it would be, you know, I didn't really think, well, there's not going to be a lot in there of interest, or that I didn't already know. And I was wrong. This is actually an incredibly good book. It has very practical, very direct sort of military sort of ways of explaining things. Very simplistic. It doesn't go into like huge details about details you don't really need to know. So this is and here is actually a cut down version of this book. Written by Colin Towell. Excellent book. Has lots of useful skills in it, some of which are kind of from the John Lofty type one, because the guy that wrote this book and John Lofty, you know, they were pretty much, you know, in the same place doing the same sort of thing, in the sense that both of them were instructors for 22 SAS, and so they compiled these books with that kind of mindset. Ray Mearsey's Essential Bushcraft is a pretty good book in the sense that it goes more into the detail of what bushcraft is. Bushcraft is different from survival, I would say. It's a more higher level instruction manual about practical type skills that you can employ well out in the bush. Pretty good. I borrowed this book very long term from a library. Not because I wanted to join the SAS, but because I was looking for a manual for how to get fit for being in the military. I was at school at the time, I was only 16 and I was about to join the British Army, and I thought this would be the perfect sort of book if I followed the instructions in here, which is a sort of day by day guide of how to get fit, what to eat, what to do, all that kind of stuff. It would serve me well, and it did actually turn out to be quite a useful book, and I did get some use out of it. So I think if you were preparing for an expedition, or you were trying to get fit for something, or you just wanted to know what the direction of thought is for a person who's doing something like preparing to join like an elite army regiment or something, I would recommend getting this book and having a read through that. These small books are books that I actually purchased because, one, they're pocket size, so you can easily take them around with you. I've got a lot of use out of these, and they're just incredibly useful. Things like tree identification, flower identification, edibles, wild edibles, things like that. You're not going to know these. You're not going to know this information unless you acquire the information from a third party. You're just not going to be able to figure it out yourself. Yeah, granted, you can sort of figure out very slowly what you can and can't eat by doing various tests, but if you want to build your knowledge, then you need to get the knowledge from somewhere. And little books like this are fantastic, especially things like, you know, the seashore one I took on coastal bushcraft trips with me, and I'll see something and then I'll skim through the book to try and identify it, and it gives me a little bit of background information about what it is that I'm doing. It also allows me to verify something. I think I know most trees in the UK, but every now and again I'll see one, maybe at a certain time of year, that I'm not too sure about, and I think, is that what I think it is? And so I'll verify it using a little book like this. It's just an excellent little tool. I use these all the time. They're the kind of books that you can't really read cover to cover and then learn everything in them unless you're like a botanist or something, but I get a lot of use out of these. I still use them today. I've had them for years, and I highly recommend these little books. On a similar note to that, I would also recommend things like this. These are identification type manuals. Now, they're not really books, they're more like information flowcharts. It gives you some background information into the identification of certain things, but they are remarkably good and easy to use. You can get ones like this. I'm not sure where I got this one from actually, but there's a lot of things like this available, especially education type centres and stuff. I mean, I even, you know, I pick them up wherever I go. This one's from like Butterfly World, which helps you ID butterflies and stuff. Fungus identification is probably my weakest subject, and I've used this guide when I've found fungus outdoors to help me identify what it is. And it's remarkably accurate. It's a very good way of being able to identify things. Other books and manuals as a survivalist I think are useful to have are things like the Survive to Fight series. Now, this one was given to me when I was a child. You can see I was so young at the time. I also was massively into Billy the Kid at the time. I think this was 1983 this book was put together. These are the issued manuals to the British Army for NBC, or Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Warfare, and they just offer incredibly basic and practical step guides of what to do in certain nuclear, biological or chemical situations. If you want an NBC suit, this also explains the correct use and function of that. It's more of an instruction manual than a book, I would say, but it's worth having something like this, I think, in uncertain type worlds. And it's probably one area that not a lot of people know much about, but if you were to ever find yourself in a situation where you did need to know about it, and you would really want a manual like this. I mean, there are other versions of this. Is the next version I've got of this, but I think this is still from sort of 95, 97 or something like that. So it's quite out of date. I'm actually going to look online and see if I can get an up-to-date version of this and then skim through that as well, because I think they're important to have, especially from a sort of survivalist or a prepper point of view. Okay, so those are really the only books that I would absolutely recommend starting off with. I haven't got a huge collection, and like I say, 95% of what you see here was gifted to me. But the ones I've pointed out are, in my opinion, the most valuable that I've found. If anybody has any recommendations or suggestions, I would like to hear about it, because I do plan on sort of updating my library on this subject matter a little bit more. There's only so much YouTube and internet research you can do before eventually you kind of just want to have